This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. We have folks from really all around the globe here today. I want to thank you for joining us today. What a year this has been. This is our last webinar of the year, but this year has been a lot of ups and downs. Through it all, ASCDI has done our best to keep the lines of communications open with our members. We've done monthly webinars, including we did one trip to Latin America. We did a trip to Europe. We did a trip to APAC. We did our disposition conference. And then we did actually some physical meetings. We did a physical meeting in Atlanta. We did a physical meeting in Minnesota, New Jersey, and we have one scheduled for California. So we're starting to kind of tip our toes back into the real world, if you will. But no matter what 2020 brings, we're going to make sure that we do maintain the line of communications with our members. We find it very important. This year, because of our virtual meetings, we were actually able to touch more members than ever before. So it was really, from a communication standpoint, it was a pretty successful year. On the membership front, we kicked off our ITAD Certified program, and really that's what today's program is all about. We're going to start off hearing from Kelsey Cameron from the Vested Group. The Vested Group has an ERP solution, and you'll hear from Kelsey just a minute. But ERP solutions are something that every ITAD needs to have. And the Vested Group, their ERP solution is based on or powered by Oracle's NetSuite, if you will. After that, our main program is going to be Patty McKenzie from SERI. SERI is the company that brings you the R2 certification. There's a few very good certifications out there. We love R2 because it really touches all angles of our business. It touches on data destruction, touches on the reuse of hardware and the recycling of hardware, all things that our members are very much focused in. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to wish you all a very happy holiday and a very healthy new year. And thank you for joining us today. Real quickly, the tools which you all know too much about already, how to use your browser. You can turn on your webcam. We don't have that many people this morning that if you want to turn on your webcam, feel free to do so. If you have any questions throughout the program, feel free to chat them to me, and I'll pass them on to our presenter. So with that, let me just turn the mic over to Kelsey now. Kelsey, take it away.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on this meeting today. It's a very important topic and excited to tell you guys a little bit more about the Vested Group and what we do here. So first off, my name is Kelsey Cameron, and I am a sales executive with the Vested Group. And if you haven't heard of us before, don't know, the Vested Group is a NetSuite-based ERP system, like Joe mentioned. But our company also has created a custom IP written within NetSuite that is specifically for the ITAD industry, and that is called Revested. So a big part of what Revested does is it helps ensure R2 compliance by enabling serialization, chain of custody, full auditing, and easy reporting that's all pre-integrated into your financials. So companies like CWG, Second Life Mac, Tech Defenders, and Stay Mobile trust us and utilize this technology today. Our software ties your entire organization together through dashboards, notifications, and alerts. And we even created a documentary surrounding the ITAD industry called Silicon Valley. I really recommend that you guys watch it. It's only 20 minutes. It's a really great documentary that we created with big industry leaders in it. It really demonstrates the ITAD processors, much like heroes, and the important impact that they have on the environment through e-recycling. And if you'd like to learn more, you can of course visit our website at thevested.com, or I'd love for you guys to reach out to me directly. I can give Joe and Patty my information to send out to you guys. But I'm here if you guys need anything or want to kind of sort through the solution and talk through your current processes. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm muted. Kelsey, thank you too. This is Joe Marion. I had a hard time finding my unmute button, so
Yeah, I
but
was like, I can keep going if you want me to.
no, but thank you. And what we will share your contact information with all the attendees. We'll also share a link to I did see the program, the movie, if you will, that you guys produced, and we'll share that with everybody as well.
That'd be
And by the way,
fantastic.
everybody, we're going to be recording today's presentation, so we'll share that with you too after the meeting. With that, Patty, let me turn it over to you, please.
Thank you, Joe. So I'd like to talk to you today about certification and is it worth the investment? Well, I can't really answer that question for your company, but I can share some information about trends that we're seeing that are driving the growth of R2, the beneficial impacts of R2, and I can also give you an idea of what R2 certification entails so that you can better determine whether it makes sense for your company or not. Next slide, please. So we're really going to talk about four things today. The who and why behind R2, trends driving the growth of R2, also an overview of R2 requirements, and then we'll talk a little bit about the benefits and costs of certification. Next slide, please. So R2 was developed in response to growing concern about how used electronics were being managed. They were often unsafely processed or illegally exported, and this caused great harm to the environment, to workers, and communities. So, and this continues to be an issue as global demand for electronics is still on the rise and devices become obsolete and are replaced with greater frequency. Estimates really vary, but the United Nations University estimates that only 18% of the e-waste generated in 2019 was formally collected and recycled. Now, I just want to say we don't really like to use the word e-waste because it's really a misnomer, because really the materials that are contained in electronic devices have great value. So R2 really emphasizes the recovery, maximizing the recovery at all points in the life cycle. But in addition to the environmental health and safety consequences, the way used electronics are managed often isn't sustainable, and it really strains the world's limited supplies of resources. Next slide, please. So in 2005, the United States EPA got together a group of original equipment manufacturers, recyclers, refurbishers, environmental groups, and others that shared concern about this growing issue. And they were asked to identify best practices for safe and sustainable reuse and recycling. What was expected to be a one-day meeting turned out to be a 3-year endeavor, and the result of their work became known as the R2 standard, and it was first published in 2008. It was revised again in 2013 with more emphasis on reuse and data security, and in July of 2020, the third version, which we refer to as R2v3, was released, and that again has really raised the bar for best practices in really all areas affecting that used life cycle of electronics. Next slide, please. So SERI is a nonprofit organization that has development and oversight responsibility for the standard, and it happens to be the only ANSI accredited standard for electronics reuse and recycling. So that puts R2 in a really elite group of national standards. The requirements in R2 were developed by the R2 Technical Advisory Committee. This is a diverse group of stakeholders representing, small, mid, and large scale recyclers, refurbishers, ITAD providers, also auditors, certification bodies. And then it also represents users of R2 services. We have original equipment manufacturers, suppliers, those customers of R2 facilities, and also some regulatory agencies. So all that said, the participation of many voices in an open, balanced, and consensus-based process really makes for a stronger standard that produces better outcomes. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to talk about some of the trends that are driving the growth of R2. Next, please. So one of the biggest growth drivers is the need for strengthened data security and heightened awareness on the part of suppliers of the risk that they're exposed to from using third-party providers. The Ponemon Institute is a leading research organization, and they specialize in data privacy and protection. And they recently conducted a study on third-party data risks. They surveyed more than 1,000 chief information officers and security professionals and found that almost 60% of the respondents had experienced a data breach that was caused by a third-party service provider, with 42% of that group reporting such an event had occurred within the previous 12 months. So companies may have security front and center while data containing equipment is in their possession, but many organizations falsely assume their responsibility ends when equipment is transferred or sold to a third party. Unfortunately, they don't realize that many regulations involving data privacy hold that original owner or users of that equipment responsible for their actions of their third-party vendors. And that is with good reason. Next slide. There have been a number of studies conducted in the past few years that analyzed used electronics that were being sold on some of the most popular online marketplaces. And so they purchased a variety of computers, laptops, mobile devices, and then they looked to see whether they could recover or access any residual data. And what they found was very troubling. Using just common tools available to really anyone on the internet, the Kroll on-track study was able to recover confidential data on 48% of the computer hard and solid state drives and 35% of the mobile devices they tested. And studies by other groups found similar results. The information that they recovered included personal and corporate data, such as corporate emails, spreadsheets, projections, social security numbers and passwords, and other very sensitive and proprietary information. Next slide, please. So particularly troubling, though, in this study was that in most cases when they found data, it was clear an ineffective attempt had been made to remove that data. That was true of 75% of the hard drives that contain data and 57% of the mobile devices that contain data. So what that really means is that the third party responsible for data destruction and remarketing was either unskilled, had cut corners, or both. Next slide, please. So suppliers are becoming more aware of these issues. And they want to maximize the value of their trade-ins and returns and retired IT equipment while still reducing their exposure to data risks and other compliance risks from third-party providers. But relying on the self-made claims of a third party or simply selling to the highest bidder can be a risky business, because virtually all third-party vendors or buyers are going to claim to be a responsible and legally compliant partner, but that's, unfortunately not always the case. Few, if any, are going to say, hey, I cut corners, or, I know a shady operator who will pay top dollar because he exports illegally, and anyone with a printer can print out a certificate of destruction, but do those words on paper match the actions of the vendor? So how do suppliers know who they can trust is really the big question. Next slide, please. So R2 certification helps to answer the question of how do you know? Strong requirements for security, for quality, test and repair, and environmental health and safety, combined with that ongoing accountability of comprehensive annual audits. All of these things provide customers with confidence that their retired IT assets will be legally and responsibly managed by R2 partners. Next slide, please. So another big growth driver for R2 is the growing number of new market segments that are relying on third-party service providers. Another recent study by Gartner found that 66% of legal and compliance leaders reported that their organizations were increasingly looking to third parties to provide services that were outside of their business's core core business model. And this is something that we're really definitely seeing in our industry. One example of this is the returns and reverse logistics industry. Consumers typically return about 20% of the electronics they purchase online. I am guilty of that. The most common reasons are they are too complicated for the buyer to figure out how to use, or they didn't really provide the solution that the buyer was looking for. But these products are essentially returned like new. However, they may contain customer data from, trying to set up an account or subscription service, and that data needs to be sanitized. So retailers and manufacturers then are turning to third-party providers to manage these returns, as well as other services like warranty repairs or trade-ins, remarketing and other activities that are outside their core business model. And many of these retailers and manufacturers are requiring their third-party providers to be R2 certified to ensure that quality control is there to reduce their risk of data breaches and noncompliance. Just a couple quick other examples of new sectors requiring R2. Major mobile carriers have developed a certification program for authorized service centers, and part of their program requires R2 certification. EPEAT also uses R2 as one of the criteria in their rating system for identifying environmentally preferable electronics, and R2 is often required for participation in OEM take-back and extended producer responsibility programs. Next slide, please. So reducing noncompliance in other areas is also driving the growth of R2. So companies don't want to be the subject of an EPA investigation or see their asset tags on the next cover story or expose about illegal exporting or toxic landfills. In addition to fines and environmental cleanup costs, the damage to company brand and bottom line from these types of incidents can be significant and long lasting. So R2 certification really provides another layer of oversight and reduces the risk of noncompliance issues. Next slide, please. Growth of R2 is also driven by multinational corporations that want to simplify their selection and oversight process for their reuse and recycling partners. Vendor oversight can be, very challenging and time-consuming for corporations that operate in multiple jurisdictions, each with its own set of regulatory requirements. So what R2 does is it harmonizes oversight and those due diligence processes for organizations that have that global presence. Because what R2 does is a big aspect of R2 is identifying the legal requirements that pertain to a facility's particular operation and jurisdiction. And so that really allows suppliers to know that wherever they're operating, that their R2 partners are being legally compliant. Next slide, please. Growth of R2 is also driven by other R2 facilities that are choosing to work with R2 vendors. And that's because the due diligence requirements in R2 require a very extensive review and verification process for all downstream vendors throughout the entire downstream chain. They also require tracking throughout that downstream chain. So to verify those non-R2 partners, it's a very lengthy and complicated process. However, if an R2 vendor is going to use another vendor that's certified to the R2v3 version of the standard, it's a more streamlined process because that R2v3 vendor has already been qualified and vetted through the audit and certification process. So many R2 facilities choose to work with other R2 facilities when possible because it just makes their life simpler. Next slide, please. And one other growth driver is a heightened awareness of corporate responsibility. The beneficial impacts of R2 really help support this social and sustainability goals of customers that they partner with. For one, R2 creates a more sustainable and circular economy for electronics by prioritizing reuse first, and that's because almost 70% of the energy and resources that are consumed during, the life cycle of a laptop, for instance, are consumed during manufacturing. So by extending the life of that product, that really reduces the environmental footprint of that laptop. R2 also enriches lives by bridging the digital divide with access to affordable secondhand products, which in turn provides livelihoods and economic opportunity because of access to new information and markets and financial services for people all around the world. So responsible reuse and materials recovery also creates jobs in the electronics repair and recycling sector. So organizations that communicate these beneficial impacts of their sustainable remarketing decisions can enhance their reputation with their customers, their shareholders, and their workforce. Next slide, please. One final growth driver too, is that its growth is driven by other entities requiring R2 certification. And an example of this is Canada's Recycler Qualification Office. Recyclers that want to participate in that must be R2 certified. So what that does is that kind of sets that entry point, and then some organizations will have other requirements that they may layer on top. But having that R2 certification as kind of that point of entry really makes the job of suppliers a lot easier. Next slide, please. So moving on from growth drivers, I'd like to give you a quick overview of the requirements in R2v3, which is, again, the most recent version of the standard. So this is just a really general overview of some key areas. The actual standard itself, I believe, has 36 pages of requirements, and you can download that from our website, but this is just a little overview. So next slide, please. So this new R2 standard has been restructured to have core requirements that apply to all R2 certified facilities, as well as process requirements that apply only to facilities that perform some very specific processes. Next slide. So again, the core requirements apply to all facilities and address these 10 key areas. So really all aspects of safe, securing that equipment once it comes into your control, safe procedures, identifying risks. Next slide, please. The core process requirements, however, again, apply only to facilities that are engaged in these specific processes. The benefit of this new structure is it allows facilities to tailor their certification to their specific operation. Not all R2 certified facilities have the same business models or the same expertise or offer the same services. Some companies are very specific. They do one thing only. Maybe they recycle, lithium batteries. On the other hand, some facilities do nothing but test and repair of mobile phones. Others do test and repair of, servers and other IT type equipment. Others do just that end of life materials recovery. So, and others do the whole gamut. So wherever you are in your business model or the processes that you engage in, you only need, you're able to tailor your certification to match those activities and only need to certify to these additional processes that apply to what you do. So let's take a look at some of the key requirements in R2. Next slide, please. So Core 1 is a very important aspect of the standard, and it requires transparency about the scope of certification. And this is really helpful to suppliers that want to search for facilities based on a specific specialty or type of work performed. A couple of things to note about certifications to the new version of the standard. First of all, it will always include, the name and any other doing business as names on the certificate, along with all of the addresses that are related to this particular certification. So maybe, the main processing facility is operating in Minneapolis, but perhaps they have an additional collection site, you know, in neighboring Wisconsin, or an additional warehouse, you know, on the other side of town. So those other sites would also be listed, along with the scope of what they do. So we want to be very specific on that scope so that suppliers understand exactly what will happen to their equipment and by whom. Any of those additional process requirements are also included on the certificate as well. Next slide, please. A really fundamental aspect of R2 is the Core 2 requirement for the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. R2 addresses the full life cycle of electronic products, beginning with the first use, and it really supports a circular economy by prioritizing reuse and maximizing the value of equipment and components and materials at each stage in that product's life cycle. So one of the things that facilities need to do is they need to evaluate what's coming in through their control and look at it. Is there a viable reuse market for this type of device? And if so, they need to direct that to reuse, unless the supplier has specified otherwise. Some suppliers may not want that refurbished and reused. They just want it to go to recycling and materials recovery. And in that case, that customer requirement would take priority. But in general, R2 facilities are looking, can the device be reused? And if not, are there parts or components that can be harvested and reused? So that's a really fundamental to the R2 standard. Next slide, please. Requirements in Core 4, 5, 8, and 9 all really help to reduce the risk of noncompliance and environmental incidents and liability. They have strong environmental health and safety requirements. We require that all R2 certified facilities also are certified to an accredited environmental health and safety management system. And the options for this are ISO 14001 and 45001, or certification to the RIO standard, which is a single integrated standard that combines environmental best practices, health and safety best practices, and also has some additional quality requirements similar to what you might find in ISO 9001. R2 also requires downstream tracking and due diligence throughout that entire downstream chain to ensure that once equipment is in that R2 system, that it will continue to be managed in a way that meets R2 requirements all the way through final disposition. Next slide, please. Core 3 and 4 both have requirements that help to harmonize and simplify oversight and legal compliance, especially for multinational corporations or corporations that are operating in different states or provinces. R2 facilities are required to identify all of the national, local laws and regulations that pertain to their particular operation and the jurisdiction that they're in. And these are required to be included in a legal compliance plan. And then during audit time, the auditors are going to be looking for evidence and records that show or demonstrate how this facility is are meeting those legal requirements. Also, import-export compliance is another fundamental aspect of R2. So facilities must provide their auditor proof of legality for all transboundary shipments, including countries where shipments may only pass through while they're en route to their final destination. Another really beneficial thing about R2 is in areas where regulations may not yet be in place, R2 requirements really fill in the gaps with best practices for protecting the environment, public health, safety, and data security. Next slide, please. Core 7 and Appendix B of the standard have really strong data security requirements, downstream verification and accountability. In addition, we have strong traceability and tracking requirements by device. So there are really two parts of the standard that deal with data security. So the core requirements in Core 7 deal with primarily the physical security and destruction of data. For companies that have more specialized requirements and facilities that offer more specialized services, Appendix B comes into place. That has it builds on the requirements in Core 7 with additional requirements that many customers require, such as traceability by device. These facilities that certified Appendix B have that extra expertise for logical data erasure. There are enhanced quality controls and also enhanced security controls and video monitoring requirements. So all facilities certifying to R2 have to meet those data security requirements in Core 7, but those that provide those extra services certified to Appendix B in addition. I'm often asked, so give me an example of each. So for instance, a community collection site, maybe they collect, 20-year-old consumer electronics from households. There still needs to be security for those devices, but maybe that county collection site is, they don't want necessarily a record of every single device that was destroyed. They just want to make sure it's going to an R2 provider that will secure that equipment and safely and securely destroy data. On the other hand, an international bank, they have different requirements. So that's where that Appendix B really comes into play. R2 also has really strong reuse requirements to ensure quality. Certification to a quality management system is required for folks that do test and repair operations. The options for that, again, are ISO 9001 or RIOS, which is that combined standard. Facilities also have to have an R2 reuse plan that details testing and repair procedures. It would also include their quality assurance plans, qualifications and training programs for employees doing those activities. And it also requires that data is sanitized in accordance to Appendix B requirements. And finally, really detailed testing records are required for every device or component directed to reuse. The R2 equipment categorization document, which we refer to as the REC for short, also supports R2 test and repair requirements with some standardized categories. This is new to R2. There are processing categories to identify electronic items as either an R2 controlled stream that requires further processing and controls or an unrestricted stream that's outside the scope of R2. It also has processing categories to define things as either pre-sanitization or non-data. The REC also has, and this would be particularly interesting to you, functioning product categories that include 9 different categories to describe the cosmetic condition of equipment or components that are being reused, and 6 different categories to describe the level of functionality of tested and working devices. So one thing to note here, though, if you or your suppliers have your own categories that you would prefer to use, that is acceptable. But what you would need to do is to make sure that those categories map to those in the REC and be able to show that mapping correlation to your auditor. Now, you don't. We have 9 categories for cosmetic description. You wouldn't need to use all 9. Maybe you have kind of an ABC system, but you would need to be able to link your categories to those in the REC. Next slide, please. Appendix A contains detailed requirements for verifying downstream vendors in that downstream reuse and recycling chain. This, again, is a very fundamental aspect of R2, and it's to ensure that all electronic equipment and materials will continue to be managed in a way that meets R2 requirements, even after it leaves the R2 facility, and it manages it all the way through that final downstream. Downstream vendors that are not certified to the new R2v3 version of the standard must be fully verified annually. Now, if you're using an R2 vendor that's certified to R2v3, the process of verifying them is much more streamlined. Again, they've already been under the scrutiny of the audit and certification process. So you just need to verify that their certificate is active and valid, and that they're qualified to do the type of work that you're sending. Next slide, please. I want to also just talk a little bit about auditing R2v3. So R2 is more than a management system. It's really a sustainability standard that focuses on the effectiveness of systems. So to just have a system and adhere to that system is not enough. You need to be able to be evaluating your systems and making sure that they're producing the intended outcomes and impacts required by R2. Qualifications and training of facility personnel is really stressed in R2, and R2v3 auditors really have extensive training in the R2 standard. We've really upped the ante there. They've had to take a 3-day course. They pass a very comprehensive exam, and all this really helps them to understand the type of evidence required and how they need to evaluate it. And the result of that really is more credibility for the R2 certification program. Next slide, please. The last thing I'd like to talk about are some of the benefits and costs of certification. Next slide. So first of all, R2 is practical and it's comprehensive. And it's really unique. It's independent. The R2 standard, isn't created or managed by a membership organization that it's beholden to for dues. And this is really to avoid any conflict of interest. It's also accredited. It's a consensus standard accredited by ANSI, meaning it's balanced, fair. It reflects the input of many different stakeholder groups. And it's also comprehensive. It includes all the necessary aspects of responsible electronics reuse and recycling. And finally, it's universal. It's applicable for all points in the life cycle of used electronics, and it also complements all national and local regulations, and it fills in gaps when regulation and oversight may be lacking. Next slide, please. So benefits of R2v3 for suppliers and customers. First, and really foremost, improved quality in certification and credibility of results. And this is because there's more clarity in the standard itself and how it was written. There's more training available for facilities and more training available for auditors. It also addresses the needs of many and diverse market sectors. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but some suppliers want to know that when they provide their retired equipment to you, it's not going to be farmed out to other people. They want to know it will be processed on site. So they're able to then look for an ITAD provider that's able to do that for them, or a recycler that's able to do that for them. So being able to tailor the certifications and have that transparency with suppliers is really a benefit. And we're hearing that from many suppliers. And also, well, I'll talk about this a little bit later. Next slide, please. Another thing, R2 makes up the lion's share of certifications for electronics reuse and recycling. So that's helpful for suppliers that, again, have presence in many different places around the world or in the country, because they're likely to be able to find an R2 certified facility. eStewards has 7% of the certifications. The European Union's Wheelabex standard has 15%, and R2 has 78%. So that's definitely an advantage for customers and suppliers with a large presence. Next slide. So what are the benefits of R2 for certified facilities? Well, first, there is increased access to auctions and supply. I was talking with a gentleman that was certified in September for the first time. He had a 2-man operation. He did test and repair of mobile phones. But in just the few months since he has been certified, his business has just expanded unbelievably fast to him. And so he's planning on adding 4 more employees by the end of the year to keep up with that growth. So I'm not saying that all people experience that same kind of growth, but we do hear that, more and more, mobile carriers or other folks that are auctioning off items, they want R2 certification as a point of entry in order to bid on their product. So that's an increasing requirement. And so it just opens up the door to access. Also, R2 certification provides increased credibility with customers and even with regulatory agencies. You have somebody from OSHA on site looking around, and they ask you a question, you're able to support your answer with, records and, the evidence that you use for your audit, for instance. They understand then that you're really, a well-run operation, and that often inspires confidence of regulatory agencies as well. Many companies report cost savings that result from quality improvements or reductions in workers' comp rates because of safety improvements, resulting in fewer claims, and other savings from other operational improvements and efficiencies. Next slide, please. SERI has developed many resources that have been designed to help facilities better understand and implement the requirements in R2. If you'd like to learn more, a great place to start is signing up for our 90-minute Intro to R2 webinar. We offer this several times each month in a variety of time zones, and it provides a 90-minute overview of the requirements in R2, so it goes over in more detail than what I just gave you. It also talks about certification basics, the process of how to develop that management system and how to get started. And we've also developed the R2 guidance and knowledge base, again, to really help facilities understand and better implement the requirements in the standard. Next page, please. So the knowledge base is a great resource. I just have a little screenshot of it here, but we have a number of different categories. So if you're just, beginning, if you're just looking at R2 for the first time and you want to know a little bit more about how to get started, check out this Getting Certified section. It has kind of overview of requirements, kind of the steps in the process, links to our consultant directory and other helpful resources. We also have a video library that has more than 35 videos. We have level 1 and level 2 training videos for every section of the standard. That level 1 kind of talks about the intent and the expected outcomes. Level 2 goes into more detail about specific requirements, and we're adding to this as well with additional videos and resources that focus more on the types of evidence and records and other topics that are things that are more topic driven. We have a new podcast library. This is a great resource. One of our team members, Roger Grivey, worked as a consultant for many years. He's worked at a number of large R2 certified facilities. He was their compliance director. And so he has a wealth of knowledge in implementing the standard. And so he has really helpful topic-driven podcasts. We release, I think we're on podcast number 6, and we have a 7th one in getting ready to be released. So we're doing that about every 2 weeks. So that's a great resource. We have, common questions and answers. And if you don't see your question, feel free to submit it, and a member of the SERI team will get back to you within, a day or two with an answer. So we really want to help facilities be able to really understand what the standard requires, to implement those requirements, and to succeed. So we have lots of tools to help you do that. In the next few slides, I just want to give you a very, very ballpark idea of what the cost of certification might be. That varies wildly depending on a number of things: the size of your company, the number of processes that you're engaged in, the complexity of your operation, the level of risk. So If we could have the next slide, please. I'll just give you a couple little scenarios. So for a small mobile phone subscriber, I'm sorry, I couldn't spit that out. For a small mobile phone refurbisher, in this example, this is a real example, 2 employees. Again, they're expecting 6 by the end of the year, but they certified to all of the core requirements, which was 1 day. They certified to Appendix A, extra requirements for verifying the downstream recycling chain, because we have a chart that lists all of these metrics and recommended times, but they have less than 5 downstream vendors that are not R2 certified, so that adds a quarter day. Now, if they would have all been R2, no extra time would have been added, but for those 5 or under, it's a quarter day added to the audit time. They've also certified to Appendix B for data sanitization, which adds a quarter day for logical sanitization only, which is what they're doing. And they've certified to Appendix C for test and repair. So that adds additional time. So for all said, for the R2 portion of their audit, it was 2 audit days. To incorporate the RIOS, they also certified to RIOS to meet their quality certification and their environmental health and safety certification requirements. And so all told for this company, their audit was 3.5 audit days for R2 and RIOS in an integrated combined audit. So for a larger company, we look down at that next block, we can see this company had 5.25 audit days. They had more employees, that upped it a little bit. So all of those things add cost. Now, I want to tell you, and I can't stress enough, that this is best case scenario. So if an auditor's on site and they see some really concerning things, what they're going to do is they're going to spend more time looking at those things. So that will add time to the audit. For an existing R2 certified company, if you've kind of had a history of some non-conformances in certain areas, an auditor is going to spend more time reviewing those areas in subsequent audits. So that adds audit time. So the best way for you to contain audit costs, which are a big driver in the cost of certification, is to prepare well and to make sure that you're meeting those requirements. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we see a different scenario. We see a small full service facility. There we're looking more at a 5-day audit. A large full service facility, might be looking at 9 or 10 audit days. And again, that would be R2 and RIOS. If you're choosing the R2 ISO option, the ISO certifications mandate longer audit times. So I would say that could add 2, 3, 4 days perhaps to your audit. But the best thing to do is call one of the certification bodies listed on our website, and they're happy to provide you with a no-cost estimate. And again, I want to emphasize this is best case scenario audit day estimates. So for anything else that is problematic or raises concerns, that additional audit time would be added to that. Next slide, please. Oh, I had one more, but anyway, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea on the audit time. Generally speaking, all of the certification bodies that conduct R2 audits charge in the neighborhood of about $1,400 a day plus travel. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what it might cost to, have that audit. Other costs, we charge a $2,000 annual license fee. If you're certifying to RIOS, they charge about a $1,250 annual license fee, and I believe they have discounts for multiple facilities. And if you're choosing the ISO certifications, they don't really have an annual recurring cost unless you get a license. But for a single user PDF copy, you can download the standard for about $150 each. But again, they mandate much longer audit time. So there'll probably be a 30% savings on that if by going with Rios. Next slide, please. So that was just a quick overview of some of the main areas in the R2 standard that you would need to, think about if you're considering R2 certification. A little bit of talk about costs and some of the main growth drivers. But does anyone have any questions for me?
Patty, there was one that popped up. You mentioned the getting certified help desk.
Yeah.
Where I'm on, I know we all know your website, and we'll share that with everybody. It's sustainableelectronics.org. Do you know where on the website the getting certified help desk link is?
Yes, it's part of the knowledge base. So if you're on our website, on our homepage, and you go to the knowledge base, actually, so you could even back up a couple slides if you want, where I had the screenshot of that knowledge base. But basically so it's that first box. It says getting certified.
Got it.
And you can get to the knowledge base from it's one of the tabs on that black, home menu bar.
Okay. And you talked about the costs. And you did mention this. So I'm going to ask you to maybe you repeat yourself a little bit. One of the biggest objections I hear from some of the members of ASCDI is, we're too small. We can't afford, to get certified. It's too expensive, too time consuming. I know you touch on the cost, but again, if you could just drill down on that a little bit, because I think that's the
Absolutely.
biggest impediment to people contacting R2 and getting certified.
Well, typically people that are interested in certification, when they call SERI, I'm the one that they'll talk to. And quite frankly, there are some cases, some organizations, it might not be quite right for them or not right for them yet because they just don't have the volume to justify the cost. So, I talked about the cost, the $2,000 license fee, the cost of the audit, but there are other costs involved too, costs of upgrading their facility. So maybe they're already a really high-tech facility. They're doing lots of things right. They just need to kind of formalize it and have that third-party audit and accountability part. So for them, the upgrades might not be such a stretch. I'm going to date myself here because on the other hand, if they're operating more Sanford and Sons type operation, so, everything's just kind of thrown in a closet. They don't really have, the structure and the framework in place for, a good sound operation. They're going to have to do a lot more. And some of it's just, work on their part, processes and procedures, but it might also be better equipment, software, that will trace things, throughout the process. So those things add cost. Another area of cost is our consulting fees. So there are companies that I've been told, pay in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000 for a consultant, and they find it worth absolutely every single penny. I had a woman a number of years ago who, when she found out the cost of consulting fees, she called me back and said, "That's my kid's college tuition money for the year, and I'm going to figure out how to do this on my own." And she did. And actually, I would say at any given time, there are probably 3 different companies that are in the process of getting certified. They're trying to do it on their own, and they probably call or email me once a week with a specific question. Now, we can't act as their consultant. That's not our role. We don't have the resources to do that. But if they have a specific question about what does this really mean, we are so happy to answer those questions.
And regarding consultants, by the way, there are a couple consultants that ASCDI, we've been speaking to these consultants over the last several years. So if you need references for consultants, feel free to let me know, and I'll put you in touch with a couple of them. Patty, you also mentioned software. Is there a requirement to get R2, if you want to get R2 V3 certified, to have something like an ERP system that Kelsey was speaking about? Is that a requirement in order to be certified?
Well, we have one requirement regarding software, and that is software for logical data sanitization. So you have to have a currently supported version that has to produce a digital sanitization record. As far as software beyond that, we don't have a requirement for that, but because we do have these traceability requirements, if for a very small organization, the two guys that are sitting at a desk repairing mobile phones, perhaps they might be able to get by using an Excel spreadsheet. And as long as they can show what comes into their facility, where it is in the process and where it goes when it leaves their facility, that meets our requirement. But for the larger you get, the more beneficial absolutely it will be if you have that kind of, a software to help you manage that.
Great. Thank you for that. And folks, there are several other, very good certification programs out there. Patty mentioned East Stewart. There's ADISA. There's NAID. There's other certifications. As I said on the onset, we like R2 because we think it kind of checks all the boxes for most of the people in our association and in our industry. But if you want to find out more about these other certifications, feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with those folks as well. Patty, thank you. Kelsey, thank you very much for sharing your information with us today. We appreciate it. Everybody, have a great, happy, and a healthy holiday and a great, healthy new year. We look forward to working with you in 2022. And as always, we're here 24/7. So if there's anything ASCDI can do to help you or your businesses, please let us know.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Great.
Thank you,
You
guys.
guys all
Thanks.
have a good rest of the day and thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.